No worries.
Ooh. Okay.
So now people, now we should notice our audience ticking up. We'll kind of let it fill in there.
Turn on
Yeah.
the light over here.
A terrible glare going at this time of day right here.
Glary.
It looks like there's a halo around you.
I know.
Ugh.
It's huge.
I should have made one of those backgroundy things because now it just it looks like he has some kind of strange hat on. Hold on.
Man, that's really hard.
Sorry.
And we're all gonna have to find a new.
Yeah, everybody's gonna get themselves situated.
There, that's a little better. All right, hi everybody.
Hello.
Numbers are coming in. Hi, I'm Gordon Douglas. We've got an amazing event, so thank you all so much for being here. I'm the director of the Institute for Metropolitan Studies at San Jose State University, which, as you may know, is a center for multidisciplinary research and public engagement on urban studies and issues facing our region, housed in SJSU's Department of Urban and Regional Planning and its College of Social Sciences. So thank you for joining us for what is our final event of the semester. You can learn more about IMS online via the Department of Urban Planning's website, and soon to be our own website coming this summer. And if you'd like to join your mailing list for future events, we do great public events like this frequently throughout the semester. Just send a message in the chat. You can chat directly, I believe, to either me or my colleague Lou Jimenez from IMS. Just send us your email in the chat and we'll add you to our mailing list. I want to take a moment before we go any further to acknowledge our privilege in hosting this event here in the San Francisco Bay Area on the unceded ancestral lands of the present-day Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and indeed on the lands of the indigenous peoples wherever you might be joining us from today. We recognize that the original inhabitants of today's Bay Area metropolitan region were the ancestors of the Ohlone and neighboring Miwok, Patwin, and Yokut people. So today's event is a very special one to end the semester with. Race and Urban Space, a book launch for the book Sparked, George Floyd, Racism and the Progressive Illusion. Got it right here, advanced copy. The book is edited by 3 exceptional SJSU scholars, Walter R. Jacobs, Wendy Thompson Taiwo, and Amy August. And the book's official release date is today from the Minnesota Historical Society Press. So congratulations. The book collects the thoughts, reactions, connections, and personal experiences of 36 academics, all writing in incredibly different ways in response to the death of George Floyd almost exactly a year ago today, on May 25th, 2020. They write about the meaning of race and racism in Minnesota and elsewhere in our country, and what it's like to be a person of color here in the United States. Today's event is going to focus specifically on issues surrounding race and urban space, an intersection of central importance for understanding everything from police violence to protest to the very fraught history of urban planning and community development in the United States. My guests are 3 of the book's contributors, Dean Wall Jacobs, Dr. Wendy Thompson Taiwo, and Dr. Marcia Williams. So I'd like to introduce them now before we get started with our conversation. Sorry about my extreme glare situation here. Well, Walter R. Jacobs is a sociologist and the Dean of the College of Social Sciences at San Jose State University. He's the author of Ethnography, Speaking the Lower Frequencies, Ethnography, Speaking in the Lower Frequencies, Students and Media Literacy, and the memoir Ghost Box. He's also co-editor of If Classrooms Matter, Progressive Visions of Educational Environments. Wendy Thompson Taiwo is an assistant professor of African American Studies at San Jose State. Her research and teaching interests include Black migration to the Bay Area, Black women and mothering, race and the built environment, and Black visual expressions of social status and class. Marcia Williams is adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Sciences at Marquette University. A sociologist with a PhD from the University of Minnesota, she teaches courses on social inequality and African American social thought and works to challenge cultural deficit explanations of racial gaps in academic achievement for African American students. welcome all of you to this event, Institute for Metropolitan Studies, and thank you so much for being here to celebrate the launch of this book. So we're going to have a conversation and then hopefully some time for questions at the end. So I'd like to start talking about a central component of the book, which is race and urban space, and in particular, interactions with the police. So Wendy and Marcia, maybe you could talk about this, you talk about this explicitly in your contributions to the book. So I'm wondering if you could each summarize those contributions for us to kind of get us into the thick of the book here. Maybe we can start with Marcia.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. In the piece that I wrote, I basically said what I think a lot of African-American people can say unequivocally, which is that I have not met or come across or had anyone in my family, a Black male, who has not had some kind of encounter with the police, some kind of situation where they've been pulled over, you know, for driving while Black, essentially. There have been times when the altercation it never got physical, but there was one time in particular where one of my friends was in the car with his white girlfriend, and all of a sudden they were reading poetry. She was about to read poetry to him and turned on the light, and all of a sudden he heard some sirens behind him, and the police pulled up behind him and went over to the car and started asking her, "Are you all right, ma'am? Are you all right, ma'am?" And he did nothing. He was actually parked right outside of his house. Now, it turns out that his mother was a prominent lawyer in the community. So he was very fortunate that way. And so when the police started asking him his name for no reason, he said, "I know I don't need to give you my name. You need to give me a reason why." And when they basically tried to threaten him to get into the police car, he said, "I can go in and we can ask my mother about that." And so they backed off. He told him who his mother was. But then they said, one of them said, I know who you are. I know who you are. Your name is Yusuf, which it wasn't. But they basically said, you know, we got our eye on you. We're going to get you at some point. So it was clearly not an issue of, you know, as we know, it oftentimes isn't an issue of, or more often than not, I would say, is an issue of someone actually committing a crime. It was, you know, the crime of being Black. And in this case, you know, a Black man with a white woman, which, you know, today may not seem like such a big deal because we have come farther in terms of at least interracial relationships than we used to. But I think people oftentimes mistake that as coming farther in race relations than we actually have. So, and certainly police relations with African Americans. So.
So for me, there's a section in my essay that speaks specifically to the murder of Philando Castile, and that event, right? That execution was not the first incident that I had been aware of up until that point, you know, in my life. So much like, much like what was just described, right? For many Black folks, for any Black person, but for anyone who's alive and aware and awake, right? There are these police murders that happen and they've been happening, right? In cities across the country. And so while the murder of Philando Castile, which happened when I was living in St. Paul with my family, my young daughter had a playmate who attended the school where he was the cafeteria worker, right? Much of these murders of Black people happen, and you know, on the one hand, they're presented as these unique incidents, but you know, to many Black people, they're part of this larger constellation of murders, extrajudicial killings of Black people that continuously happen, that have been happening, and that mark our consciousness and our life maps in in these generational ways, right? So a lot of my students today are not old enough to remember, or I mean, they weren't alive when Rodney King was viciously assaulted by police officers, but I was, right? And I wasn't alive when there was a young boy who was murdered by police in Hunters Point, was running away from a police officer who shot him. It was a teenage boy, right? I wasn't alive then, but my father was alive, right? So, I mean, it becomes this generational memory of both high profile and everyday interactions with the police. But just to return to my chapter, I mean, the murder of Philando Castile, this was something that unfolded at an intersection that me and my family were very familiar with, right? So it was like, it felt very personal. There were people, my colleague, like I mentioned, her daughter attended the school where Philando Castile was employed. I remember going into the classroom and kind of bringing my grief with me into the classroom and sharing with my students. And then all of them began talking about, how this was a terrible trauma, but it wasn't something that was so unfamiliar to them, right? So the police have long since been these, it's almost like a haunting, right? Like they are the thing that watches you, at all times, and remind you to a large extent about the fragility of your life as a Black person. So, I mean, it was that one incident connected to many others that really set the stage of for me, right? So to kind of look at my own life and the lives of other Black people in Minnesota as being very difficult, right? I mean, you're expected to live and grow and thrive, but under these circumstances, right?
Thank you for that. Yeah. So Wendy's essay, and I should point out, Wendy, you also have like essentially a poem in the book as well. That's really powerful. But in your essay, there's a really powerful statement where you say, but as much as Castile's murder was about restricting Black mobility on the open road, it was also rooted in the legacy of redlining and the dedication of law enforcement agents to continue to defend and protect the borders of Minnesota's wealthy white suburbs, such as the one in which Castile was killed. And so many Black people in Minnesota are familiar with the roads through these suburbs, having driven on them to commute to work, get to shopping outlets. This is all your quote, right? Or to take road trips to summer destinations. And while these trips are much less daunting than they were during the Green Book era, you write that Black drivers are still sometimes routed through neighborhoods that are very purposefully racially exclusive and where African Americans are visibly not welcome, right? So I wonder if next each of you could discuss elements of the built environment itself that illustrate this. And let's start with Walt this time.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So even though I identify as a Minnesotan now, I lived in Minnesota for 14 years, really had very positive experiences for the most part, some negative ones as well. One of the things that we talk about in the book is, we've had both good and bad experiences. But I grew up in the South. So I'm originally from Atlanta. Atlanta is probably my hometown using the traditional definition. So I moved there when I was 2, all of my elementary school, my middle school, my high school. So Atlanta is pretty much my hometown. If you ever go to Atlanta and you're driving down major roads, you'll notice that when the road crosses over another major road, it changes names. And you're like, what is going on here? Why is this road? It's the same road, but it has a totally different name. So in a 3-mile radius from my house where my parents live, I think one road changes from Veltri Circle to Peyton Road to Hamilton Holmes Drive. And I was wondering, why is this? And I think the answer, I haven't seen any official studies about this, but I'm pretty sure that the reason was to let drivers know if you were in a Black neighborhood or a white neighborhood. Growing up in Atlanta at the time, it was pretty much all Black and white. We have many more Asian American folks and Latinx folks now, but when I was growing up, pretty much a Black-white town. So these road signs, part of the built environment, let you know if you're in a Black neighborhood or a white neighborhood. I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, another southern city, same thing there. So these southern cities, physically demarcate, which neighborhood, is for which racial group. Another interesting thing is, before coming to San Jose State, I was at the University of Wisconsin Parkside in Kenosha, right down the road from Milwaukee. So I would go up to Milwaukee where Marcia lives now. And sometimes, after visiting Marcia, I'd go drive over to one of the wealthy white neighborhoods, the suburbs called Wauwatosa. I'd love to drive a street called North Avenue. So unlike Atlanta and Charlotte, it was North Avenue the whole way. But interestingly, once you passed over about 55th Street, there was a little bit of a buffer. So they're like, 53rd, 54th, nothing was there, maybe a few houses. Then you had 55th, then you had 56th and 57th, nothing really there. And then you had the houses started to get more and more wealthy. And most of the folks who were there were white. The other side of 55th, they're mostly African-American. So you had this buffer zone, it seems like, that everybody knew that east of, 55th, this was the Black part of Milwaukee, west of 55th was the white part of Milwaukee. And then of course, right next to it were the suburbs. So very interesting part of the built environment. So I don't know, Marcia, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts about Milwaukee, this interesting architecture.
Yeah, well, when you're talking obviously about, driving to my house, I mean, it is quite amazing to me, at least when you get into Metro Milwaukee, how you can literally go, a few blocks away. I mean, you're talking about 55th to 90th or something, but, it can be, 55th to 30th or, even 40th to 30th, and you will see two starkly different environments. So I could literally be driving through 10 minutes. I live on the east side, go through River West, it's a little bit more rundown. And the further south I go, the more the buildings are boarded up, the more the housing is run down, the poorer the upkeep of the highways themselves. And when you were talking about streets, it kind of reminded me of, there's a Chris Rock stand-up, where he talks about how Martin Luther King Boulevard is in every city, and how that is always winds up being the most violent street. Now, that isn't necessarily the case here in Milwaukee. We do have a Martin Luther King Drive. However, that is kind of a, oh my God, it kind of demarcates when you're starting to enter, quote unquote, the hood, right? When you're starting to go from the good parts of Milwaukee, where, people live in like 15 and 14 bedroom mansions with 10 houses and they have moats and stuff like that, which is just insane to me, to where people are literally, they're dealing with lead paint, still falling off the walls, or roaches in their houses and things like that. So as you were talking, Martin Luther King Drive definitely stood out in my mind. And I know also that like highways 94 and highway 43 South in particular were built right through Black neighborhoods to basically destroy housing, businesses, any kind of thing that would help promote Black economic independence and sense of community. So
maybe a quick thing to add too before Wendy gives her thoughts is that some of the articles in the book itself also talk about so-called urban renewal, right? To go through predominantly African-American neighborhoods to make way for these highways and these freeways. I think a few folks in the book talk about the historic Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, very vibrant, but it was bisected by Highway 94 going through St. Paul, and it's been unfortunately in decline ever since.
Sure. And just to kind of continue with that thread about the thread about highways. I don't know, I mean, thinking about how, they were intentionally, across the country, right? And many major urban metro areas, right? Like they were intentionally placed through Black communities, and how they also were deliberately, or I don't know, right? Inadvertently, deliberately, they became these barriers, right? And these barriers that acted as a containment zone, right? And then looking at the ways that public transit also, public transit networks were either routed into these neighborhoods or completely, avoided these neighborhoods, reinforces this notion of Black communities becoming these very isolated, almost like a warehouse, right? Like this warehouse district where you have freeways on all sides, you don't have a lot of transit options, and so folks are just kind of like stuck while the rest of the city is allowed to continue moving towards progress and allowed to develop and advance, right? But in thinking about the built environment and ways in which racial exclusivity kind of manifest themselves, I think about spaces that are in transition, right? So neighborhoods that folks used to avoid because it was dangerous to go there, right? Like you can't go, we can't go there, right? There's nothing there, or it's a place that it's like a no-go zone. But when you start seeing these, I always refer to them as these monuments of gentrification, right? So like these glorified, like these really pretty bike lanes, right? It's not just the white line, right? Like they now have like actual, what is it, like these concrete pillars, right? So the cars cannot hit the person, and they're painted these really nice, beautiful colors. In Oakland, I've seen them, these, really bright green, right, pillars. You have the repaving of streets. You have the sidewalks being extended, lanes being condensed, right? So what might have been formerly 3 or 2 lanes, now you have a one-way street going on. And on the one hand, there is there's this intention of improving the quality of life, the safety, the security, and the ability of folks who are living in urban spaces to be able to go out, participate in recreation, get out and walk more, ride bikes, right? There's not just new trees, but then new types of foliage being put in, right? So all of these with aloes being planted, right? So it's really this beautification effort, right? It's the greening of the city, but there's a violence that goes along with, the ways that the cities and these particular neighborhoods are changing or transforming. For a lot of Black folks, older residents in these neighborhoods, as soon as you start seeing these markers, right, these monuments go up, right? And I think that the tombstone is when you see the first either Trader Joe's or Whole Foods show up in your neighborhood, then it's kind of like some kind of, there's a certain kind of death that happens in this neighborhood. But to a lot of older residents, these markers represent kind of like a ticking down of time, right? So it's only a matter of time now that many of us are going to get displaced. It's only a matter of time now when things change and this community, right, is going to be overrun or overwhelmed by folks who are going to look at this space and occupy it and claim it. And now, maybe call the police on some Black folks who are gathering, right? Like Lake Merritt, right? So Lake Merritt, it's a public space. This is in Oakland. And you have some Black folks, like out of all the people around the lake though, right? Some Black folks barbecuing. But that in and of itself, becomes this disruptive event to the point where the police have to be called. Oh yes, that too. When a neighborhood starts to transition, when you start seeing these, these monuments, right? These edifices of gentrification, right? This reinvestment by the city leaders, right, to improve these neighborhoods, that the police are going to start surveillancing because, when you now have nicely paved streets and you now have boutique stores and these artisanal bakery shops or, this wood fire pizza stuff coming in, there's going to be folks with more money coming in, whose safety needs to be protected, right? In a different way than that the safety of former residents were being protected, right? So, I see a lot of this because I'm from the Bay Area, so I see a lot of this happening in many of this, our cities today. This is happening all over LA. This is happening. This is happening back, over in the Twin Cities, right? And so a number of Black folks have been both leaving, but also, they've been pushed out of the Twin Cities into outerlying suburbs, right? And so, just kind of think about Dante Wright, right? The murder of Dante Wright happening in Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center or Brooklyn Park? Well, the Brooklyn.
I guess Brooklyn Center, but I get them confused.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. These two suburbs, they're both outer suburbs of the Twin Cities, right? Where you have this growing number of Black residents, Black folks who are Black and brown folks who are living out there, right?
That's Brooklyn Park because they nicknamed it Brooklyn Dark, like after that started happening. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
These are the connecting threads, right? You have gentrification, you have displacement, but for Black people, right, the police are everywhere, right? The police are everywhere, constantly surveilling, and so the built environment. Where there's really no space where we're completely safe. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was tempted to ask, maybe I'll save it for later, but just to kind of, I'm curious about additional features of the built environment that maybe are the flip side, right? That feel welcoming or secure, or I was even thinking about like George Floyd Square that has sprung up in Minneapolis, right? It's kind of a counterpoint or a different side of the same coin, right? Of the built environment being kind of adapted by Black and brown people, right? To memorialize or whatever it is. So yeah,
maybe
we'll come back to that.
Maybe one other
sorry.
One more thing that's quickly connected to that, Gordon, that we also may mention is in Oakland, Lake Merritt. So Wendy earlier talked about the discrimination that Black folks, felt in Lake Merritt. But one of the things that the city is trying to do now is to set aside spaces where vendors can, sell their goods. And these vendors are predominantly Black and brown. So earlier, the neighbors would complain about them, just taking over the spot. So the city says, hey, let's try to find a space where it can be a little bit more regulated, where folks can feel safe and not harassed. Have the public safety officers there, but they're there to answer questions rather than to enforce noise ordinance and things like that. So that's working okay so far, right? It's an experiment, but I think the point is that sometimes cities do have these creative responses to try to deal with some of these issues.
Oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead.
No, but just thinking about that, right? So that's something that's very formal. Yeah, I heard about that, right? So this is a project that the city of Oakland has taken on. They're also, and so they've created different task forces to kind of look at how they can make the city more just for everybody, right? So it's not like they're solely catering to wealthier residents. But I'm thinking about informal ways that folks, so thinking about what you said, Gordon, like, and informal ways that Black and brown folks in the community come together to create spaces that are not, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily, I mean, safe, but this is not the intention. Like, I'm just thinking about how Black and brown youth, not only in Oakland, right, but primarily in Oakland, right, reclaim the streets and the use of streets by having sideshows, right? So like, you know, at any time of day, you know, a particular intersection will be shut down for, I mean, as long as they can shut it down before the police arrive en masse, right? And they take the, you know, they repurpose these streets into these recreational spaces that they normally do not have otherwise, right? I know folks have shut down the Bay Bridge and had a sideshow, right? So really contesting what these, you know, what streets and freeways, highways are intended to do, right? Which is, I guess, primarily cater to commuters. I mean, in the Bay Area, right, and in much of California, right? Thinking about who uses these streets and who gets really angry about not being able to get through, right? I mean, and it's always the through part. And so that disruption, I think, is one example that speaks to, you know, your question of how are folks in the community using space differently?
Especially when you think about, as you and Marcia and Walt have all talked about, how often streets have been used to divide communities, right? And freeways have been used to destroy communities, right?
Yeah,
sorry,
I'm sitting
Marcia.
here and I'm thinking of, you know, spaces indoors in Milwaukee, maybe like churches, sometimes, you know, barbecues, or once in a while block parties, but they seem to have decreased quite a bit over the years, I think, understandably. And I don't, you know, Milwaukee is really one of the most, it's among the top segregated cities in the country. And it's not even just like Milwaukee as a whole, because Milwaukee as a whole is not diverse, but it's more diverse than you would think. It's Milwaukee proper, it's or the Milwaukee metro area, it's Milwaukee and the surrounding suburbs. And so literally Milwaukee is has it like is like 80% Black or something like that, and then it's like 90% around, you know, in the suburb rings around the area, you know, 80 something percent up. And so it's so segregated, and you know, the racial demographics of each area are so clearly demarcated that to go outside and, you know, try to reclaim the streets, at least during the daytime, is not something that one can easily do. And in fact, I would say the opposite has occurred. I have a colleague who is doing some research with, you know, middle-aged men from the inner city of Milwaukee, and how, you know, researching how they took care of themselves, you know, like what their self-care, their health care, their like nutrition, exercise, et cetera. And she would have focus groups with them in the afternoon. And when the sun would start to set, they would say, okay, it's time for us to go. And she'd be like, well, why? You know, we still have a little bit more time. And they're like, okay, it's just so unsafe that we have to be inside our houses before dark. And with them, it wasn't just the police, it was also the younger people who were starting to get into recreational drugs that were more laced with different things. But my point is that the effects of I'm not even just going to say segregation, well, of segregation itself, not necessarily separation, but segregation, have been so detrimental that, you know, huge, bulky 40-something-year-old men are scared to be out at night, you know? And so one can only imagine how, like, you know, you add that to the police in the day or even the night, it's that much scarier. I hope I made sense. Sorry, I'm talking kind of in circular fashion, so.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I want to turn to Walt now. Earlier, both Marcia and Wendy discussed individual reactions individual experiences they've had with the police or reactions to particular instances of police violence. And I'm curious if you've had any direct racialized experiences with the police that you can share.
Yeah, I definitely. One of the things that Marcia talked about earlier is that she doesn't know any Black man who's not had an encounter with the police, and I can say the same thing. Everybody that I know who's Black, who's had an encounter, I've had encounters, even though I grew up in a very privileged area of Atlanta. So even though it's in Atlanta itself, it's basically a suburb. The mayor of Atlanta lived there for a while. The president of Morehouse College. Rich bankers lived there, very privileged area. In fact, when I lived in Minnesota, was interacting with Marcia, she would always tell me about how bougie I was, how privileged I was. Now Wendy has picked that up as well. But yes, I admit it. I was very privileged as a kid growing up. But I had, there are three interactions that come to mind. The first one was, my high school was very segregated. 1,600 students, all but 4 were Black. We had 3 white guys and 1 guy from Vietnam. But we were on, my little clique that I was part of, group of friends. There were 5 of us, 4 Black guys and 1 of the white guys in our clique. We were visiting him at Fort McPherson, which is just outside of Atlanta. And so the 4 of us in the car got pulled over by the cops, and we're like, Chris, were you speeding? No, what's going on? And okay, we're sitting there for a few minutes, and then why is the police approaching us? 10 minutes later, another cop car pulls up. We're like, oh, they called backup on us. And so these was 4 skinny, nerdy Black kids, right? Very privileged. We're not gonna do anything at all, but they still pulled us over because we're 4 of us. A second incident, I don't remember. So my friend Charlton swears that we got pulled over by cops at Georgia Tech, where I went to my undergrad. So I think I blocked it off because I didn't want to tarnish my memory of undergrad at Georgia Tech, but he swears that we got pulled over there. The third time was when I was in grad school. It was around 11 p.m. For some reason, I'd forgotten something in my office. So I lived about 3 miles away, but I biked it. So I got on my bike and I started riding, and I'm like, wait a minute, I've forgotten something. Forgotten my wallet. So one of the things that folks of color always learn, especially black folks and black boys, is to talk. You may have heard about that. Is what to do. If you're going out in public space. What to do, don't do if you get pulled over by the cops. Always have your ID on you, for instance. So I remember went back, got my ID. Luckily, it helped me because I got pulled over on my bike by a police officer. And the officer says, come over here. And I'm like, okay, officer. It's like, what's your name? Walt Jacobs. Are you sure about that? Like, I think so. Give me some ID. Pulled off the ID, looked at the ID, looked at me, says, okay, we just got a report about Black guy rolling around, throwing rocks, and I saw you, and so I'm okay, have a nice day. And fourth time, actually, one more memory came to mind. I got pulled over for having expired tags on, I was driving a friend's car, had expired tags, but they got a warning. But of course, I was nervous, when it happened. What's going to happen here? I think I was in grad school then too. But other than those 4 incidents, I've not had many incidents. So again, very privileged. But again, no matter how privileged you are, if you're Black, you're going to have these interactions with the police.
Mm-hmm. And in a letter that like an email that you sent out to the College of Social Sciences last month after the Derek Chauvin verdict, you also describe a traffic stop. Can you describe that again for us?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for reminding me about that one, Gordon. So right after the trial was over, I decided to go get a burger that night, and I definitely wanted to go to some place that was Black owned, support the community. So I went to a burger place over in Berkeley, and on the way back, decided to take a leisurely route. Car that had 2 African-American guys in it, passed me. It was an older car, a little bit beat up, had the temporary tags. The guys were wearing hoodies. I definitely noticed that. So we pulled up to a stop. I was behind them, and they were behind a new car, a brand new Audi. So I didn't know what the driver was, but so it could have been Black, could have been white, could have been Latinx. But the main thing was, we're waiting for the light to turn, and the Audi had its backup lights on. So it had backed up a little bit to not be in the intersection, but the backup lights were still on. when the light changed. And so the guys, two African Americans, honked at the Audi. The Audi honked again, honked back at them. And I thought that once the Audi would hit the gas, they would ram into the car because the backup lights was on. So I still had the backup. So, and I got really nervous. What is going to happen? If this happens, you have this accident, and the police show up, and the police, identify these guys who kind of fit the description. They're in an older car. They're wearing hoodies. What I'm going to have to do to kind of take action and bear witness. So luckily, though, the Audi, just shifted into normal gear and pulled off. But I think what that illustrated to me was, again, we're always have to be aware of ourselves in space. Always alert about what's going to happen if there is a problem. Are we going to bear witness? Are we going to be prepared to help folks who might need it? And that's one of the burdens, quite honestly, of being a person of color, being Black, is in these spaces out in public. You're always on alert. You can't quite totally relax and enjoy being out in public.
Yeah, I mean, and got a great deal of research has documented just how impactful that can be on people, right? To be carrying that burden. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I wonder, we talked. I already kind of raised this question a little bit of the flip side of the built environment, but I wonder also if we could talk about kind of maybe the flip side of these negative, or what you call wretched in the book, experiences, right? There's this whole first section of the book is called the wonderful and the wretched, and which also talks about sort of positives, I guess, of racialized life in urban space. And I wonder if any of you have experiences to share.
Hey, Wendy, you got to start it. You got to start the conversation that we had.
Me and Walt are on the brink of just busting out laughing because this is the back and forth. This is the wonderful wretched about Minnesota. But this is definitely you, Walt, right? Like the wonderful part. I can go on and on about the traumascape of Minnesota, right? Or and elsewhere in the Midwest, because it wasn't just Minnesota. Minnesota was one version, right? But wonderful. The Mall of America. So it's like, isn't the largest mall in the United States. And I would take my daughter, so yeah, my family, we would go there, especially when it was snowing, right? Or, when it would be freezing cold. It was one of the places that was big enough where you could walk multiple laps and have something new to see, right? I mean, you just walk around this huge mall, shop if you want or not. So, I mean, have fun memories visiting the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So it was a free art museum. They had great programming. I mean, I guess most of my wonderful, so it's like split half and half, right? So half of the wonderful memories, the wonderful parts of Minnesota are tied to experiences that I had with my daughter. Or, my son was born there in 2017, right? But he was really young. So it was mostly my daughter when we were living there, who, we would take outside to these different places. And so it made it really wonderful to have these positive experiences. Like, I mean, I would take her with me to estate sales on the weekend, because you can get really affordable, if not cheap, mid-century modern and vintage decor that reminds you of your grandmother's house, right? And so I would buy record players and quilts, and it was great with my daughter with me. But also there was a walkability. So Walt's not the only bougie one, I guess, right? I lived in a very upscale, wealthy-ish, predominantly white neighborhood in St. Paul. So this was Highland Park, and I actually chose it. I signed the contract on our apartment sight unseen, just because of the walkability of this neighborhood, and also the apartment, right? So The downside is that it was right next to a Baker Square, right? But I mean, you could walk to the grocery store, you could walk to the library, you could walk to, eateries. And for me, it's really important. I mean, for me as a Black person, right? For me as a Black person and a horror film, post-apocalyptic film lover, right? It's important for me to live in a place where I can walk to anything in case zombies, right, a blizzard or some other kind of obstacles, prevents me from driving, right? So I need to be able to walk to something, and there has to be food and other kinds of amenities, and this place was that. So we walked around a lot, and it was nice, even though we were one of the few Black families that walked around the neighborhood, and so a lot of white folks would like stare at us when they drove by and saw us. So yeah, wonderful. Walt.
So one of the things, maybe going back to the urban space thing, and this is one of the things that my wife Valerie first noticed. She's also African-American, and she's from Philadelphia. And she grew up in kind of working class neighborhoods in Philadelphia that looked kind of like Oakland, like Wendy. Some a lot of boarded up buildings and factories that had been closed. But she noticed that Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, but it seems like it had 10,000 parks too. Every neighborhood had parks, and they were well maintained and had lots of programs in them. So we took tennis lessons, for instance, and Val was like, taking public tennis lessons for basically $5 for the entire summer, something really cheap. So she was really impressed about the energy that Minneapolis put into its parks. So that might have been one of the things that I remember, one of the more wonderful things about Minnesota. I don't know, Marcia, do you remember anything? What are some of the positive things you remembered about your time in Minnesota?
I like the parks too. It's very clean. I feel like Minnesota had a kind of as many problems as exist there, racially. It just had this kind of mellow vibe that I really liked. I mean, I'm kind of a loner and a homebody, so it's not like I was going around all over the place and partying and all of this stuff. But I think that when you're not worried about being shot or something like that, there's a certain serenity to I don't know, the green that is in Minnesota. Like here there's much more concrete. It's much grittier. Minneapolis anyway is really beautiful. St. Paul is really beautiful, and I think that is I know that's something I miss quite a bit from living there.
So thanks, Marcia. Maybe one other thing to put in, I'll start it, and then Wendy can jump in and say, "Wow, you're crazy." This concept of Minnesota nice. So essentially what that means is that Minnesotans are very, very polite. But they're not going to share their true feelings with you, but they're not going to get up in your face. They will help you. They will help you pull your cart of a snowdrift. They'll talk about the weather, but then they'll smile, then they'll go their separate ways. So growing up in the South, again, we talked about these spaces that you knew what neighborhood you were in, right? You knew if you were in the right place or the wrong place. Southerners are very outspoken, very direct. So if somebody's a racist and hates you, there's no question. Whereas in Minnesota, you really don't know, what their true feelings are. But for me, and many people have a hard time with that. But for me, I liked it. I don't care. To most acquaintances, I don't really care if you like me or not. Smile, go your own way. That's great, right? It's really hard to break into friendship networks in Minnesota. So people have been there for a long time, have got very deep friendships. So if you're a newbie, it's hard to make connections. But when I went there, I had kind of a built-in connection. So I went to a place that had a lot of new assistant professors, and we kind of bonded together, and I made very close friends. So by the time after 3 or 4 years, I had new people showed up. I honestly didn't want them to come into my friendship circle. I'd become a Minnesotan. I wanted to have this closed circle. So Minnesota nice for most people is really a problematic thing. And of course it does have problematic aspects. but it does have that more welcoming piece too, at least for me anyway. So I don't know. Go ahead, Wendy.
I mean, I felt like I couldn't trust them. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know, right? Like it's like I couldn't tell if it was a facade, like how deep, like if it was it a facade? And if it was, how deep did it go, right? How deep below do you have to dig until you kind of find the horribleness? But then again, I'm always like 1 foot, like waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? But I mean, the Minnesota night, I mean, yeah, I mean, I've saw that in action, right? So like, you know, when you see it in action, it's this really beautiful thing. Like it was during a blizzard, and it's all like so much of it happens, and to not exclusively, it doesn't exclusively happen only in the winter, but a lot of it happens in the winter, in, you know, the middle of a blizzard or bad snowstorm. I remember a bunch of folks just, you know, out my window, just seeing a bunch of folks get out of their own cars and come out of nearby businesses to help push other stuck cars out of the snow, right? Push them out, but also to try to push an entire metro transit bus that was stuck, right? Like that kind of energy, that kind of desire to help. It was something from like a 90s era rom-com movie, right? Like before they fall in love, they do this thing together, right? Like they push the bus out of the snow together, and then they fall in love and stuff. And it's like the snow is falling. But the other super, super wonderful thing for me about living in the Twin Cities, about Minnesota, are the Black folks there. Oh my gosh. I mean, and especially my Black students, loved me so much and taught me. And yes, I was a grown person, but in many ways they were too, and like raised me, right? Like raised me up, raised my consciousness. And so in the ways that you talk about having these transformative experiences, well, I can't ever forget that, right? I mean, it wasn't just witnessing and feeling very personal, these kinds of traumatic events. It was also having Black folks who I trusted, who were so generous with me and patient with me, my students, who pushed me, right? That made my experience not wonderful. They were wonderful, right? But bearable and okay. That's all you're gonna get. You're not gonna get wonderful wild.
All right, I'll take it.
That's you guys have a way more positive view of Minnesota nice than I do. I'm from the East Coast, so we're kind of, I think, the antithesis of Minnesota nice. My sense of Southerners is that they're, you know, blunt, but also polite, you know, whereas, which is not to say East Coasters can't be polite, but blunt tends to supersede everything else. And I know that for me, that often became a problem when, for instance, I'm saying something passionately or even just saying something as I see it, and I am seen as aggressive. And this is one of the kind of interesting things about that, is that in that particular sense, I felt like you could be from any race, from any gender, from, you know, have any sexuality, whatever. And this was like a very regional thing, right? So the tone of your voice, you know, the inflection of certain words, all of that could, you know, put people off of you. And it was just kind of amazing to me that just saying, I think this could be seen as aggressive or as assertive or off-putting. I do, you know, understand the politeness. I have a similar dynamic to the one that Wendy's talking about with my students now. I don't remember having such a thing in Minneapolis. But yeah, my experience with Minnesota nice has been largely frustrating and isolating, and which is interesting because I wound up with someone who grew up in Minnesota, but that kind of sometimes is a cause of conflict where I'll just be stating my point passionately and, I'll be apparently coming across as, kind of angry or something like that.
So Marcia, just kind of hit the computer. You're like, the computer's from
Huh?
Minnesota. The computer's from Minnesota. You're like, come on.
Yeah.
No, but she's telling the truth. She's telling, because I was at an all college meeting and I asked a question. I didn't even have any kind of tone. I'm from California. What kind of tone do we have here?
I know.
I was like, why am I the only Black person in the room? Like, why don't any of the departments hire other Black people? And after the meeting,
People are like,
they were no, but like they had to wait till the meeting was over and I left. And then they all went up to my chair and were like, we're really disturbed by what Wendy said. And he came and told me later. And I'm like, I just asked a base, like they can't.
I know. It's really frustrating. It's like, I don't want to say grow up. It's just a very different way of looking at stuff. But it's like, avoid any kind of conflict at all costs.
Yeah.
And it's like, this doesn't even have to be a conflict, man. It's just like, we're just like talking, just being straight with each other. But in any case, sorry if there's any Minnesotans out there that are highly insulted right now.
You're making me hella sad right now.
Yes, I am so insulted by both of you. Both of you are not my friends anymore.
Well, so can we talk, speaking about these regional differences, right? Let's stay on that, but maybe bring it back to urban space. And I wonder if in doing so, we could talk about kind of different experiences of something fundamental to race and urban space, which is segregation, right? And how, because we know, right, there's segregation, extreme segregation in West Coast cities, in New York City. They just look very different than it does in, for instance, Chicago, where I lived for some time, which is like famously quite segregated. And, Walt, you talk about your Minneapolis house, and I know you now live in Oakland, and or if you could talk about different experiences of what segregation looks like in these different places.
Now, see, that's just how bougie he is, talking about different houses and different locations. This is my Minnesota. This is my. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, but if he talks about his house in Minnesota, he has to talk about the ghost.
Marcia, I'm gonna.
So it's now as a bougie ghost. But go ahead.
Can we do something about Marcia? No, I'm just kidding. I miss Marcia.
You're gonna mute her video.
But the interesting thing about the houses, though, is again with that privilege. Growing up in Atlanta, always being houses with my family, but the neighborhoods were all Black. So again, I mentioned that my high school was 1,600 students, all but 4 were Black. My neighborhoods, no white people at all. They're pretty much all Black. Atlanta is super segregated. Minneapolis, there's some, predominantly Black neighborhoods in Minneapolis, North Minneapolis and some parts, down in South Minneapolis, close to George Floyd Square. But for the most part, the Black folks are kind of spread out, right? They're sprinkled here, sprinkled there, especially the ones who are more privileged, like I was. I lived in a neighborhood called Prospect Park. So I think we were 11% of the population of Prospect Park that was Black. So very, very low percentage. In Oakland, on the other hand, it's the most diverse neighborhood I've ever been in. And Gordon's in the same neighborhood too. He's 1 block over. But I think the demographics, back in 2010, Gordon, I don't know what they were for the 2020 census, but 2010, they were 40% Asian, 20% Black, 20% Latinx, 20% white. So really nice mixture. My block got folks of all of the all races. But what we're seeing, though, of course, is that as houses get flipped and renovated, most of the buyers who are buying those houses are white. And so Oakland over time has, the population of Black folks has really dramatically decreased. So Black folks are moving further and further out. Antioch, I think, is one of the cities where a lot of Black folks are. So I really hope that my neighborhood, which I love so far, which is pretty diverse, doesn't lose that diversity. So that's one of the things that I'm afraid of happening. But so far, it's kind of holding on, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of close this out here with a question about the conclusion of the book and about George Floyd, and then hopefully we'll have maybe a few folks who want to ask some questions if you guys can stick around. But So the final chapter of the book, Sparked, begins with this paragraph. Sparked, George Floyd, Racism and the Progressive Illusion was published 1 year after George Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020. Several of this volume's essays discuss the author's whereabouts and reactions that day. In this concluding chapter, each of the book's editors discusses their memories of May 25th, 2020, and outlines a hope for an aspect of racial dynamics in the United States of America on May 25th, 2022, the second anniversary of George Floyd's murder. So sitting here just a few days before the first anniversary of that sad day, I wonder if you could each share one sort of hope that each of you has about urban spaces specifically for May 25th, 2022.
Why don't I start off? Something comes to mind right away is this this initiative in Oakland called the Slow Streets. So Gordon's very familiar with it. I think you know a little bit about it too, Wendy, but essentially, you know, when the pandemic started, Oakland closed some of its streets to car traffic. So people can still drive, they live there, but you couldn't drive, they weren't thoroughfares anymore. So the idea was to get folks out and walk these streets, you know, have a little exercise, get outside of the house. And we've actually there's one 11th Avenue goes right past Gordon and me. We see people out all the time. The issue, though, is that for the most part, the folks that you see on the slow streets are the more privileged folks. So a lot of white folks, don't see as many Black people on the streets, Latinx folks, few Asian Americans, but I think the number has gone down with the unfortunate rise in Asian hate. I think the numbers are going down. So a year from now, I'm hoping that we can figure out ways to really diversify the slow streets. I think, Gordon, maybe one of your students is doing some research on that. So that's one of my hopes, is that we can figure out ways to encourage people to get out and really enjoy these spaces that were meant for anybody. But right now, unfortunately, they're stratified. You know, the rich, the privileged are the ones who use it. The folks who are not quite as economically privileged don't use it as much.
I'll go next. I actually, in thinking about this question, I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that I teach a course called African American Social Thought. And that is a course where we trace the lineage of racial history in America as it has affected Black lives and the social thoughts that have arisen out of those out of our racial culture and the experiences that have been derived from them. And one of the things that my students are always both fascinated by and kind of deflated by is the fact that as we trace the history, we see the same challenges arising over and over and over and over again, right? It's not like this is the first time we're dealing with poverty or police brutality or voter suppression, homelessness, any of the ills that the Black community face today have always been there, and we've always been fighting to overcome them. So it's hard for me, like the tone of my essay was like this, and and that I was like, I don't really have much faith that that this movement is going to continue on, with the kind of energy that it has right now. And that sounds jaded, but that's just kind of where I'm at, just having taught that course so many times. So I would say that my hope is twofold, maybe threefold. But one of my hopes is that urban spaces they're all more kind of abstract. One of my hopes is that urban spaces can be recognized as not the problem, but spaces that have problems. The problem that urban spaces mirror is white supremacy, violence, and genocide, that has resulted in or manifested in all the problems that we see in urban spaces. My second hope is, and I can't, now I'm having a brain fart, sorry. COVID has just like reduced me to 2 brain cells. But what I always tell my students, because they do get discouraged, is that The victory is in the process, not the outcome. Because if we always focus on, we only have victory if we get what we want, we will never feel victorious. But if we keep fighting, then we are victorious, because to fight is to be human, and to therefore fighting helps us reclaim the very humanity that people have attempted to take away from us. So my hope is that the youth that I teach, the youth in America, whatever their racial background, but I'm thinking particularly of Black youth, is that they recognize that social change starts in the mind, that their worth is not based on outcomes. Their victories aren't based on outcomes, but processes, and that they can continue, they can pick up the baton and continue the fight that we have been making since the inception of this country.
Yes, I mean, it was Angela Davis, right, who said freedom is a constant struggle, right? So it's ongoing. I mean, to think about, so first of all, I don't do hope. Like Walt knows that I'm like an action man. Like I like practical, like I just do it, right? And I think that 2022 is too soon, unless we all unless I don't know, like we just become, but we become this cataclysmic force that is able to blow up white supremacy. I always tell my students this. Some of them get scared because the language, I guess, is too strong. The like blowing up part probably, but settler colonialism, right? White supremacy, blow it up, blow up the anti-Blackness, blow all that shit up, right? I have never seen the houselessness, right? The unhoused situation as bad as, 1981, like I was born 1981, and here we are today. I've never seen the situation this bad, right? For the majority of my life, it was always, this country talking about, well, look at how they live, and they're all in slums, and they're on the streets, and oh my God, it's horrible, and we're a democracy. Look at Oakland, right? Where, I was born there, I grew up there, like the urban, because so kind of thinking about urban cities, urban space, we're in this very, and we've been, right? Like in many urban cities, we've been in this constant, this contested relationship over who owns urban space, who owns it, who controls it, who has a right to live there, who can really belong, right? My father's people came out during the Second World War, right? From Louisiana, came out, first lived in Marin City, right? And like a lot of Black folks found all these racially restrictive covenants. Can't live here. You have to live, over here in this contained space, right? I grew up in Oakland during a time, right? Like the 80s, right? What was happening, right? We're looking at the effects of deindustrialization. You're looking at crack in a lot of the neighborhoods. You're looking at, young people, right? A lot of Black folks not having a lot of economic opportunities. What does the school look like, right? What are people being told about their potential, right? During this time period, you have kind of like this ongoing massive divestment from urban cities, right? Like it's too full of poor people. It's too full of Black people. There's no future in the city, especially the downtown districts. Just let it go, right? Like just let them die. And you see this happening in cities across the United States, right? They're going up in flames. People, it's no one wants to live there. No one wants it. It's trash. And then there's this reinvestment, this new interest, right? And as you have this new interest and you have capital now, coming into these cities, you have, urban spaces being rebuilt. and rethought of, reconstructed, reformed, right? The same folks. I mean, it's just like urban renewal happening over and over again. I don't know, Gordon Douglas, I'm sorry, I'm gonna take us to like 8 o'clock tonight talking about this. But it's just, it's these constant iterations. It's a different generation, different folks, different actors, right, in these roles, right? But it's the, you know, same thing, right? And so, I mean, I look at what's happening, what's happened. Walt, you mentioned Antioch, right? And Black folks living out there, or even in Sacramento, right? Like these, you know, in Victorville, right? Where's that, right? Like just leaving these urban, who left these urban spaces, and really, you know, kind of watching the, you know, becoming involved in similar conflicts in these suburbs while watching these urban spaces be renewed. I don't know, this is to say that I maybe am too much of a pessimist to have hope. Barack Obama would be disappointed in me.
I don't think he wouldn't now. He would have in 2004 or 2008.
We're on the other side of that.
Yeah. Remember his hair's all gray now for a reason. He didn't go out of there saying, yes, we can. So.
Oh no. I mean, Gordon Douglas, what hope do you have? You have to help us end on a good note.
That's not for me. That's not for me to say in this. I mean, in this context. But I mean, gosh, I mean, I sure relate to, you know, some of what you're saying about having. I was also born in 1981, and my goodness, visual homelessness, like visible homelessness, I mean, has been part of Californians' lives forever, but has never been like it is right now. And that certainly tells us something. And I hope that it doesn't look even worse in 2022.
Right.
That's one thing I can say, just as somebody who lives in Northern California and is a Northern Californian. But I just want to say thank you to the three of you for sharing all of this with us today here, for adapting to this kind of topic that Walt and I cooked up to make it, you know, specifically about urban space, even though the book is about a whole lot more in addition to urban space. But I do see that at least a couple questions have popped up, so I kind of want to get there. So first, let me just say thank you. Thank you for all those questions and for that wonderful conversation. It was amazing to hear. I'm gonna hold up the book again because that's my job. You can get it anywhere you buy your books on the internet. You can go to a local bookstore and ask them to order it. That's always fun. You can get it from the Minnesota Historical Society Press directly. It's a totally reasonable paperback purchase, thankfully. Not you know, sometimes they make these things so expensive.
Right.
But this one is not. So so go get it. I'm gonna go to the first of these questions, if that's okay. Which is from Roberto Gonzalez from SJSU's Anthropology Department. He writes, could one of you say something about how Latinx communities fit or don't fit into urban spaces? And he says, I'm here referring especially to undocumented immigrant communities in East Palo Alto, East Oakland, Richmond, and so on, just to take the Bay Area as an example. And I'll let you all answer that, and I'll encourage others to put questions in the Q&A if you would like.
Well, I know in Milwaukee, segregation, you know, it's like there's the whites are in the suburbs, blacks are in particular northern Milwaukee, and Latino Americans and Latino immigrants are in southern Milwaukee. So there's definitely kind of a space for everybody. We're all wonderfully separated. I mean, not just kind of a poor taste joke, but in any case, so there definitely is a concentration of the Latino population in the south of Milwaukee, there is an increase in percentage of population of Hispanic Latinos in Wisconsin, period. And then I know teaching at Marquette, the highest group of students, the highest percentage of students of color now is Latino, my Latino students, and they too feel just as segregated and just as outcast as the African American students there. A lot of similar reasons. Some things don't overlap, but certainly segregation is a huge issue. Racism is a huge issue. Violence is a huge issue. Dehumanization. So I don't know if that addresses your question enough, but I can start it there.
I'll take a stab. Thank you for your question, Roberto. In two ways, right? So first of all, hell yeah, Latinx folks, including undocumented folks, immigrant folks, do fit in the urban, in urban space, belong in urban space. And just thinking about Oakland again, and there's parallels, right? So like in parts of Richmond, you see this, I've seen, right? Kind of like this filling in of a gap and then holding the line against gentrification. And I can elaborate, right? So I was teaching, I mean, in many of my courses, in many of my AFM courses, I always lend some time to talking about access, right, food access, right, in urban cities. And we talk a lot about food deserts, right? But then at some point, right, and this is like in collaboration with some of the Latinx students that I have, who talk about their experiences, which helps me jog my memory and think about, like geographically, like spatially, like what's in the space, right? Like think about your own experience instead of just, kind of speaking more generally. That many of these places that I was referring to as food deserts aren't necessarily food deserts because there's always some kind of supermercado or tienda, right? So like this filling of space, right? Where you have or had a lot of white retail stores and, or this abandonment, right? By white chain or chain grocery stores and other types of retail and amenities that kind of leave communities that were predominantly Black and that became increasingly brown. You have entrepreneurship, right? So small business opportunities that Latinx folks kind of took on and began providing, initially, right, it was providing, and specifically it was providing food stuff to folks in the community who didn't have access and who couldn't find this stuff in stores, but also like, in these potential food deserts, right? I mean, a lot of Black folks were able to go and get fresh groceries, right? And food, right? So thinking about how, there is this space, and it's not always this conflicting space, but a space that can be and is beneficial, right? To the larger group at hand. And then also like in holding the line, right? So like, here I'm thinking about Fruitvale in Oakland. Well, Fruitvale, Gordon, Fruitvale, right? Like it's very vibrant. There's a lot, you can find whatever you want there. There's community, there's kids playing, there's families, there's cultural institutions. There's this absolute, it's almost like this oversaturation, but it's like this absolute complete use of space to the point where it makes it hard to kind of, for gentrification to kind of put its, and I'm sorry that I talk about gentrification in such a negative way, but it can't really put its tentacles in, right? The way it has, where is this? Along Telegraph, what do they call this? What is it? The Temescal what is that neighborhood where they have all the outdoor eateries and all that? The
Mhm.
place where we, the Eritrean restaurant, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, in Fruitvale, it's harder to do all that. It's harder to displace. It's harder. I mean, it still happens, right? But it, you know, kind of in looking at spaces to colonize, right? Can't really do that with Fruitvale because it exists, right? It's almost like a city within the city, right? And it has its own pace, sound, flavor, texture, right? Like it's this this space and entity and experience and community that came in and like made it, you know, like these folks came in, families came in and made it theirs, and it's thriving. So definitely belong. There's the vote for belonging in urban space. Well,
Yeah, one thing I'll throw in there too, and is also kind of influenced by Bill Lester's comment in the chat. Thanks, Bill, for putting that there. You know, thinking about going back to my experience in Atlanta, you know, when I grew up, it was pretty much a black-white issue. There was black folks, white folks, very few Latinx folks, very few Asian Americans. So the issues were framed in terms of black folks versus white people. But now, you know, we're seeing more people, more Latinx folks in Atlanta, more Asian American folks in Atlanta. You know, even in Oakland, you know, it's very diverse. So I think part of the issue is, you know, shifting the frame from just a black-white frame to looking at the issues and concerns of other racial groups as well. And maybe also looking at the potentials and also the problems for solidarity amongst the various groups. So I'm thinking more about Asian Americans now, more so than Latinx folks. But you know, we're seeing the rise in Asian American violence. In Oakland, you know, some of the Asian American elders who are being attacked by black folks, unfortunately. So not always the case, but a lot of the high profile ones, you know, you have black youths are attacking Asian elders. So the natural tendency is to say, well, look, here's those black people just acting up, you know, all the stereotypes are true again. But I think people are trying to look at, you know, what are the more complexities that are happening here? So, you know, Asians and black folks and Latinx have been redlined. They've been segregated in these areas. They're fighting over scraps. How can we turn that around? How can we build solidarity? You know, how can we have events in which people come together to really understand, you know, the histories of various folks? You know, many people don't know the history of our Asian American neighbors, for instance. You know, that is not, Asian American studies is not as widely implemented as Black studies, for instance, Wendy's department. So we need to have more of these classes to help folks understand, you know, what do we want to do? So I don't know exactly what this theory would be, but you know, some kind of a, you know, intersectional analysis is to look more at, you know, how these groups come together contextually, and class is a big part of it as well. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I'm from a very privileged class background. To look at what can be done to encourage, you know, folks who historically had to move out into the white neighborhoods to be successful. So folks like me, privileged African Americans, you know, how can we be encouraged to stay in urban cities and work with other folks who are not quite as privileged to look for solutions for all of us?
well, I don't know, Gordon, has urban, like the word and the concept and or maybe the representation, has urban become kind of like a dirty word similar to inner city, where it you know, kind of had the negative, it has a negative connotation, or folks
That's
still.
an interesting question. I would almost argue, I think that it probably has, and I would love to hear what other folks in, you know, in the chat or in the room think about this. I mean, I feel like it did begin to get that connotation, right? Like it was becoming kind of synonymous with inner city or something, maybe. But I think you could equally argue that over the last 20 years, there's been a big romanticism for the urban, you know, right, especially among privileged people, and which is driving gentrification, right, to some extent, right, is driving this quote unquote like return of the white upper middle class, you know, highly educated, high income earning, et cetera, like driving to move back to the urban core that they supposedly, or did, indeed flee in the 50s and 60s, right? And this whole kind of move back, quote unquote, back to the center, as if people hadn't been there the whole time. But
Right.
I think the term urban is kind of like, the hood intertwined with cultural commodification, right? So, I can, this is like, this still, is, symbolic of a certain group of people, but I'm romanticizing, I'm extrapolating the experience of that group of people that I think is kind of cool, like where they live, the kind of, kind of like happy multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it can be simultaneously, very racialized in a very objectifying way and still be seen as cool. In fact, those two things oftentimes go together, kind of like when people completely, are into native population spirituality, but do absolutely nothing to, help, or not even help, but work with communities to realize justice and equality. So, urban, I think, is just a dirty but hip word, kind of like the Urban Outfitters store. It's you go there to pay like $50, look like, to buy a shirt that looks like you bought it from the thrift store. You were going to give it to the thrift store, but so.
Well, and I would say my colleague Bill Lester is pointing out here in the chat that he's not saying so much that urban is taboo or not, so much as that the federal government has moved away from a focus on it, which is an interesting commentary on really the state of like national politics, right? And who's trying to play to what audience, I think. I don't know if that's
Yeah, come along those lines, the ongoing experiments of universal basic income might also be instructive here. So when we have cases where universal basic income is really geared towards communities of color, really helping those folks who've been historically discriminated against, redline. But when you explicitly say that it's for people of color, as I think was the case in Oakland, Gordon, or was it some other city in which at first, they said, this is going to be rolled out, but it's just for Black folks and Latinx communities, and there was pushback. Why are you racializing this thing? Whereas in other areas where it says, it's really the language they use is more in terms of class, but of course, class and race are highly correlated. So as long as you don't explicitly call out the racial aspects, even though that's what you're trying to accomplish to address some of these ills, there might be some. I have some hope that some of these universal basic income initiatives might start to address some of these inequities.
So I'm going to go to a question, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time here, but we do have just 2 more questions, so maybe we can
squeeze them in.
So we have a question from David Malinowski in the Q&A. He says, are there particular initiatives, efforts, actions underway in the South Bay that use public space as a medium for disrupting the status quo or achieving a more racially just future that you see as having real potential, whether large scale or small? And I would say if we can, anywhere in the Bay really would be useful to answering this question, because I just, knowing that my panelists are actually in the East Bay.
Again, I think 2 things come to mind for me in the East Bay. I'm not sure if they're doing as much of this in the South Bay, but the Slow Streets initiative that we talked about earlier, really trying to get people out there to take advantage of urban space, to live healthier lives, get out and walk, especially when we're stuck in COVID. Right now it's not working quite as intended. The privileged are using it more so than folks who are not as privileged, but hopefully we can make some adjustments there. Another thing that comes to mind is, Oakland is attempting to solve the homeless, the unhoused issues. So as Wendy was talking about, the numbers are just atrocious. If you go any street on Oakland, any underpass, just tons and tons of unhoused folks. Oakland is trying various initiatives to address it, including letting some of the camps self-organize themselves to try to implement some of the ideas that they have. So I think that's also kind of promising. So, we have this, sometimes we fetishize the experts, but we don't listen to the folks who are in the communities themselves. So I think that might also have some promise too, to kind of listen to the folks who are on the street to have their ideas about what we can do to solve some of these problems.
mean, I also know that there's there's been a growing number of urban farming collectives, right? So urban farming, so groups that have come together, purchased a lot of land, right? So usually at an abandoned lot somewhere in parts of deep East or West Oakland, and have turned the ground, right? So like turn the soil into like a bountiful crop, a space where they can grow bountiful crops, and a number of these collectives have brought in folks who were formerly incarcerated, and together are, learning about the connections to the land, growing food, distributing food, as a way to give back to the community, and to I guess incorporate folks who are otherwise stigmatized because of their former incarceration status, who then are able to, like in some cases, sell the food at farmers markets and then make money for themselves. So I know that's happening too. South Bay. So this is kind of rude, right? South Bay is
San Jose, where you are employed. No, just
at least for now, right?
Where we all are employed. So one other thing that's popped in my mind super quick, I definitely have to give a shout out to our colleagues in urban regional planning for their certificate in real estate development program. So a real estate issue that has occurred to me is there's a huge development in Oakland called Brooklyn Basin. I give Gordon a hard time because he hasn't gone over there to check out the new Township Commons Park. Is one of the
I have now.
Okay, good.
I went.
Good. But
After the last hard time.
Okay, but I think there are plans for maybe like 20 buildings, Gordon, something like that. But of the first two,
it's huge. It's like what, 4,500 new residents or something.
Yeah, but the first two buildings. So the first building was market rate, but the second building had a large number of below market and affordable housing units that were earmarked for that. So I think that was part of the reason why the project was greenlit, that there are a certain number of affordable housing units that are supposed to be part of this big complex. So it's not perfect, for instance. So both of the buildings look the same. That's one of the things I really like, that the buildings look the same. The one that has affordable housing is closer to the highway, so it's not perfect, right? So it screens off the one for the market rate. But I think, I hope that trend continues, that as they build out the other 18 buildings, that there are a number of affordable units in those buildings.
Yeah, and I'll just add, not to get too planning wonky here, but in addition to that kind of inclusionary zoning stuff that Walt is talking about, I think there's a lot of potential in these community land trusts that we are seeing increasingly successful in the East Bay, in Berkeley and Oakland especially, that are essentially nonprofits with different funding systems, but often some public funding, to find ways to buy existing housing and keep it permanently affordable, right? Keep it in a land trust. And there is one of those being started right now in San Jose. It's in the process. Actually, one of my awesome graduate students is doing his report on that, just finished this semester. So that's an exciting thing happening in the South Bay, just to connect there. I also want to point out that Dr. Travis Boyce did point out, in terms of the urban question, that there's also this suburban, right? There's the contrast between urban and suburban still very real in the political discourse, right? Which is a great point, and which connects to what Walt and others of you have said about what does suburban even mean, right? Now that we have this very suburbanization of poverty, for instance, to use the kind of popular term, where and especially the displacement of communities of color from Oakland, Richmond, et cetera, out to these cities much farther out, or towns much farther out, which is maybe challenging, or will eventually lead to a challenge to our stereotypes about the suburb. maybe even in good ways, I think could be kind of exciting. So did anybody else, did I cut anybody else off or not give anybody else a chance to jump in there at the end?
Do we have one more question? Do we get them all?
I think we got them all.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for giving us your time this evening. Thanks to the audience for joining us. The Institute for Metropolitan Studies will be back in the fall with more exciting events. And in the meantime, please go out, check out Sparked, George Floyd, Racism and the Progressive Illusion by 3 terrific SJSU editors and a huge number of wonderful contributors, including Dr. Marcia Williams. So thank you, Wendy, thank you, Walt, thank you, Marcia. Congrats on the book, and good luck with its launch and many successes to come.
Hey.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cool.
Bye, Walt.
Wow.
Okay, so thanks Gordon, thanks Lou for technical assistance. I think that went well. Yeah, we went over like 40 minutes, right? So that's always a good sign.
That's right.
That was from the standpoint, really, really amazing conversation. I personally did want to have a conversation, ask sort of a question, because when I lived in Oregon, there was a talk about civil rights, like a panel of civil rights activists that were very active during the civil rights movement. And so they were kind of showcasing and kind of pinpointing the highlights of the movement pretty much.
Mhm.
And I walked up and during the question and the Q&A section, I had walked up and my question was like, as a DACA recipient in Oregon at the time, the same relation of the Latino community with the Black community. Do you think it's evolved in any way? Or has it gotten stronger? Has it gotten, in my perspective as just myself, I do think it has gotten a little bit more involved, but I'm curious at your point.
Yeah, that's a good question, Lou. That was one of the things that so many things were in my head, but you kind of didn't get a chance to talk about it. Unfortunately, there's been competition between Black folks and Latinx folks, especially about housing, about stores. I think, Wendy talked a little bit about that a little bit. Many Black folks are against DACA and immigration, have quotes. So, I think that's one of the unfortunate things about the competition between the various groups of color. But I'm hopeful. I'm a little bit more hopeful than Wendy and Marcia that we can have these initiatives, getting people together to talk about how our interests are aligned. If we work together to fight against some of these things. But you're absolutely right. I think it's been contentious in the past, and unfortunately, it still can be contentious, especially if we have another economic recession. That also drives it too, right? So it's easier to have these coalitions when times are good, but when times get tight, yeah.
It gets worse. Yeah, the same when I had asked this, their question was like, well, we did boycott grapes. And that was like the most they've done. And for me, it was like, as a 2020, now it's 2020, I'm surprised that it's very much
still there.
Yeah.
Another thing too about, for Latinx folks, as you know, it's an ethnic category, not a racial category. So some, Latinx folks identify as white, some identify as Black, some identify as mixed race. It's that all further complicates, coalition building.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Okay, good to see you both. Have a good night.
All right.
Have a good night,
Thanks,
guys.
Walt.
Okay, bye.
Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.